Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns they're going to be selling in their upcoming April of 2018 Premier Firearms Auction. And one of them that we have here is a Gibbs Carbine. And this is truly a perfect example of how difficult it can be to actually manufacture a gun. So this is a Civil War era carbine. This was the design influenced by some other carbines of the early 1850s. The design was patented in 1856. In 1857, well, the inventor was a guy named Lucien Gibbs, and he put together a team of 3 guys, and this seems like a good way to go about doing this. He also had a man named William Brooks, who was his financier, and he had a man named WW Marston, who was a gunsmith. So between the 3 of them, one guy has the idea, one guy has the money, and one guy has the skill. This would be a good way to go about setting up a gun company. And that's pretty much what they do. In 1857, Marston manufactures 20 examples of the gun by hand, samples, that sort of thing. They actually shoot one for a group of officers at West Point in 1858. And those guys think, doesn't seem to be a bad gun. And then the Civil War breaks out. And so in December of 1861, they get a contract from Ripley, a U.S. ordnance officer, to make 10,000 of these carbines to supply the Union Army. And at the same time, they also get a contract to make 10,000 standard pattern rifles as well, because the Army is going to need both. So, seems to be an awesome thing going. They've got all the groundwork done, they've got the gun, they've got the guy to make it, they've got a factory set up. Marston has a property he calls Phoenix Armory in New York City. And boy, they're going to make a bunch of money and a bunch of guns, and it's going to be great. Let's take a quick interlude to look at how this gun actually works, what it is. Like most of the cavalry carbines of the Civil War era, this was a breech-loading gun because having to muzzle load and deal with loose powder and ramming bullets and all that sort of nonsense while you're on a horse is quite difficult. So the cavalry were the first in line to get breech-loading arms. This is a single-shot carbine, not surprisingly. It is percussion fired, so you would put a percussion cap there, and then it actually uses a self-contained paper cartridge with powder and bullet. And in order to load it, you're going to start by pushing this button to unlock the lever, then pull the lever down, and as you pull the lever, it is going to pull the barrel forward and then up, like that, giving you access to drop a paper cartridge. I'm resting it on the muzzle, so it's trying to close. Drop a paper cartridge in there. When you seat the barrel back in place, it is going to drop down over this ring to help seal the action. And you can see the little fire hole right there. That's going to push through the paper at the back end of your paper cartridge to ensure that flame from the primer gets in and ignites the cartridge. So once you've got a cartridge in there, pull the lever back, it will cam the barrel into place, snap the lever all the way down to lock it. You would then fully cock the hammer, put on a percussion cap, and you're ready to fire. We have pretty typical carbine sights on this. V-notch sights. You've got a 100 yard, and then you've got a flip up for 300, and a stiff flip up sight for 500. The barrel is held a bit loose on a pivot joint right here to allow it to cycle forward and back and up for loading. You can actually see the lever that does all the work underneath here when we look at it upside down. As is typical for a cavalry carbine, we have a bar with a sling ring here for connection to the cavalryman's single point sling. And the lock plate has this nice little US Eagle, or possibly chicken, and WMF Brooks, manufacturer, manufactured New York, 1863. These guns are not serialized. Now, let's go back to the story. Well, by the spring of 1862, they still haven't managed to get a sample gun manufactured. They've got some subcontractors lined up for some of the other components, like barrel blanks and stock blanks and that sort of thing. But it turns out it's kind of difficult and expensive and time-consuming to try and tool up a factory for gun production right at the beginning of a war when everybody else is trying to do the same thing. So finding machinery, finding workers, all of these things were proving to be, shockingly, a lot more difficult than Gibbs and Marston and Brooks had anticipated. So Spring of 62, they still don't have a gun. And they go back and they actually, through some technicalities, they re-wrangle the contract. They actually drop the contract for the rifles. We'll pass on that. We'll get the carbines done first. And they get a new contract in June of 1862, again, for 10,000 guns, and it stipulates that the first deliveries are going to be in August of 1862. So everything's clear. They don't have to worry about infringing, violating their own contract by not meeting the dates. They've got a couple months. Well, okay, August of 1862, they still don't have any guns. December of 1862, they still don't have any guns, and at that point, the original team pretty much gives up. They sell the whole kit and caboodle to a guy named George Opdyke, who happened to be the mayor of New York City. And he buys in for something like $65,000. And I guess he figured he's got the connections that he can make all this stuff happen. And they've already got a contract in hand, and this should be a really easy money-making sort of deal. It kind of is. And he puts the right team in place, people who actually have been doing this sort of thing for a long time. They understand what's required. They tool up that factory. I'm sure there was no political corruption involved at all in getting the supplies and the workers and everything they needed. Surely that didn't possibly happen. But I tell you what, by June of 1863, they've got guns delivered. They deliver 550, I believe, carbines to the government in May. And then in June, they've got another 500 or 502 that they deliver. By goodness, they are making this actually work. By July 13th, they had another 500 guns ready. They had like 6,000 guns partially completed, having manufactured stocks of parts for as many as 6,000. They have another 500 that are all done in the factory and ready to go be accepted by the government. And they get up on the morning of July 13th and discovered that there is a gigantic riot sweeping New York. The Union has declared conscription, the draft. People aren't really thrilled with this idea, and riots break out in New York City. So, of course, it's okay. A gun factory is, very important to the government. They recognize this, and of course, the gun factory owned by the mayor is going to get police protection, and so it does. The police show up. In fact, it was like the factory manager who showed up that morning and found the police at the factory carrying Gibbs carbines, because the guys in the factory who saw the mob coming down the street just started handing rifles off the rack that, hey, the government's ready to accept these. Well, tell you what, give these to all the cops to protect the factory today, and we'll deal with getting them to the government, after we're not in immediate danger for our lives. So the policemen are all armed with Gibbs carbines. And mob shows up and starts banging on the doors of the factory. Things are looking bad. And the police, who are inside, they tell them to stop, and then they just shoot through the door. And they kill the first guy in the mob, and they wound, I think, 2 more guys. And that's it. That was as much as those guys had an interest in. The mob turns around, leaves, and finds some easier place to loot. Pretty good. Job done. 2 hours later, still quiet, the police pack up and leave. They're probably needed elsewhere. And everything seems fine until at some point later that afternoon, people showed back up, lit the factory on fire, and burned it to the ground, complete with the 500 guns that were ready to go and the parts for 6,000 more. It is a complete loss. Nothing survives. Oops. Seeing this, Opdyke's the mayor, so it's a little sketchy for him to be directly involved, So his son-in-law files a suit with the city, suing them for the total value lost of about $190,000. That's a lot of money in 1863. Basically saying that it's the city's fault that the factory burned down because they took away the police protection too early. Well, the son-in-law says, yeah, my uncle, or my father-in-law, the mayor, has nothing to do with this company. And Opdyke says, oh yeah, I have nothing to do with this company. But Opdyke is on the committee that deals with this suit. And so Opdyke decides that, well, this claim must be valid, and hands over a check for $190,000. So the city of New York ultimately pays for the complete loss of the gun factory. There are no further carbines manufactured. There was a grand total of 1,052 actually completed and delivered to the Union Army. They were actually issued out to the Missouri Cavalry, and the first ones went to the Missouri Cavalry. The second batch apparently went to a couple units of the New York Cavalry. Now, my understanding is reports from the field were not all that great on the gun, so maybe it's not a huge loss that they didn't manage to get the whole 10,000 manufactured. But this, I think, is just the quintessential perfect story of how difficult it can be to actually get a seemingly very simple firearm into actual mass production. Hopefully, you enjoyed this little interlude and anecdote about the Gibbs carbine. If you would like to have one of these in your own collection, they are, as you might expect, a relatively rare U.S. military-used Civil War carbine. If you take a look at the description text below, you'll find a link to Rock Island's catalog page on these guys, where you can see their pictures and description and price estimate on this particular one. You can place a bid online for it, or you can participate in their auction here at Rock Island live in April. Thanks for watching.